It was just another quiet shift at the edge of the solar system. Nothing special, nothing loud. The kind of shift where you watch numbers scroll across a screen and sip lukewarm coffee from a dented mug. Out past Neptune, where sunlight barely reaches and silence is the only constant, the outer perimeter array hummed softly, doing its job. Watching, listening, waiting, then without warning, space itself seemed to shiver. A ripple tore through the void, not a sound. Not a flash, but a distortion in the fabric of space-time. From it emerged something no one had ever seen before. Not a single ship. Not even a dozen. A whole fleet, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sleek, dark, and utterly silent like shadows given form. They didn't broadcast identification codes. They didn't respond to standard hails. They just appeared, and then they started moving. Straight toward the inner system. Toward Earth. Panic didn't hit right away. At first it was disbelief. Glitch, someone muttered over the comms. Cosmic ray interference. But the readings kept coming back clean. This was real. Very real. Within the hour, emergency alerts lit up every major government and colony network. The United Planetary Council, a group made up of Earth, Mars, the Moon colonies, and the asteroid belt settlements, was called into emergency session. It wasn't fancy. No grand hall with marble floors, just a secure virtual chamber where tired faces blinked in from across the solar system, some still in night clothes, others squinting through the red haze of a Martian dust storm. "What do we know?" asked the Earth delegate, voice tight. "Next to nothing," came the reply from the belt. "No known design. No energy signatures we recognize. They're not broadcasting, not scanning, at least not in any way we can detect. But they're accelerating. And they're not slowing down." Mars argued for immediate evacuation protocols. The belt wanted to activate the old defense grids, rusty relics from the resource wars, barely functional. Earth's military reps pushed for a show of force just to signal they weren't helpless. But before anyone could agree on a single plan, a new transmission came through. It wasn't a threat, at least not in the way anyone expected. It was a message, short, cold, repeating on every open channel in broken but understandable standard. Surrender or be cleansed. No explanation. No demands beyond that, just those 5 words, looping like a nightmare. People on Earth didn't see spaceships. They saw headlines. They saw shaky phone footage of news anchors stumbling over their words. They saw their kids looking up from dinner and asking, "Are we in trouble?" And for the first time in generations, the whole planet felt small again. Not because of distance, but because something out there had decided they were a problem. Cities didn't shut down. Not yet. But you could feel it. The quiet tension in grocery lines, the way neighbors nodded a little longer at each other, the sudden spike in people calling their parents just to hear their voices. No one knew what cleansed meant, but it didn't sound gentle. Back at the array, the young analyst who first spotted the fleet sat frozen, fingers hovering over the console. She'd only been on the job 6 months. She'd signed up to track comet trajectories and calibrate deep space sensors, not to be the first human to witness the end of everything. But she kept watching, because someone had to. The fleet kept coming. By the time they crossed the orbit of Saturn, Earth's governments had agreed on one thing. They wouldn't fire first. Not unless fired upon. It wasn't bravery, it was desperation. They had no idea what these ships could do. One wrong move and it might be over before it even began. But the aliens, everyone was calling them that now even though no one knew what they looked like, didn't attack. They didn't even seem to notice the patrol drones sent to observe them. They just moved with eerie precision, formation locked, heading straight for Earth like it was already theirs. Then, without warning, they stopped, just beyond the moon's orbit. The entire fleet powered down their forward thrusters, hovered, silent again, and then a new message came. Not a broadcast this time, but a direct feed to the council chamber. A figure appeared on screen, tall, angular, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that reflected no light. Its voice was calm, almost bored, as if reading from a manual. "You are unstable," it said. "Your species breeds chaos. Your emotions override logic. Your expansion is unchecked. You infect systems with unpredictability. This ends now." It called itself Vrel, spoke for something called the Cathari hegemony, a name no human archive had ever recorded. According to Vrel, humanity had been under passive observation for decades. And the verdict was in: Earth was a biological hazard, a threat to galactic order. The demand was simple: full planetary disarmament, immediate quarantine, and something called genetic reconditioning, a phrase that sent chills through every scientist in the room. It sounded less like diplomacy and more like erasure. The council erupted. Some delegates shouted. Others sat in stunned silence. One from the lunar colony stood up and said, "We haven't even met you."
How can you judge an entire species?
Pharrell didn't blink. "We have watched your wars. Your pollution. Your self-destruction. You nearly killed your own world twice. You are not ready for the stars." Then came the deadline: 72 hours. Surrender or be cleansed. The feed cut out. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the Earth delegate leaned forward, voice low but firm. "We are not surrendering." But the real answer didn't come from politicians or generals. It came from the streets. Within hours, people began gathering, not in anger, but in quiet defiance. In Tokyo, students sat cross-legged in parks, holding candles. In Nairobi, musicians played songs of peace under open skies. In Buenos Aires, families stood on rooftops with handmade signs. "We're not your enemy." In Reykjavik, children released paper lanterns shaped like doves into the Arctic night. No one organized it. It just happened, like humanity, faced with extinction, chose to show its best self instead of its worst. The Cathari fleet watched, and for the first time their perfect silence seemed less like control and more like confusion, because they hadn't expected this. They'd come expecting fear, resistance, weapons. Instead, they found people singing, crying, holding hands, offering olive branches when they'd prepared for swords. Back at the array, the young analyst finally took a breath. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was part of something. And as she looked at the live feeds from Earth, millions of ordinary people choosing hope over horror, she whispered something no one else could hear. "We're still here. And for now, that was enough." The message from the Cathari envoy hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Everyone could smell it, but no one knew how to clear it out. Surrender or be cleansed. 3 days. That's all Earth had. Inside the council chambers, voices rose and fell like waves in a storm. Some argued that giving in was the only way to survive. "They have weapons we can't even see," one delegate said, rubbing tired eyes. "If we fight, we lose everyone." Others fired back, "If we give up our freedom, what's left to save?" The room buzzed with fear, logic, and desperation, but no real answers. Outside, though, something different was happening. It started quietly. A school in Oslo canceled its regular lessons. Instead, students wrote letters not to their leaders but to the Cathari. Simple words on recycled paper. "We don't want to hurt anyone. We're sorry for the damage we've done to our planet. Can we talk?" They didn't expect a reply. They just wanted to be heard. Then in Mumbai, a group of teenagers set up cameras on a beach at sunset. They didn't chant slogans or wave flags. They just sat in a circle, sharing stories about losing grandparents to illness, about falling in love for the first time, about planting trees in their neighborhood. They streamed it live with one title: "This is what we're made of." Within hours, similar gatherings popped up everywhere. In Cairo, elders played traditional music under the stars. In Vancouver, indigenous communities held a sunrise ceremony inviting strangers to join. In São Paulo, street artists painted murals of hands reaching across galaxies, not in war but in greeting. No government ordered this. No corporation funded it. It was just people, ordinary, scared, hopeful people, choosing to show who they really were when the universe was watching. The Cathari didn't respond. Not at first. Their ships stayed dark and still beyond the moon, like statues carved from night itself. But Earth kept speaking, not with weapons, not with threats, but with voices, songs, tears, and laughter. Then came the moment no one saw coming. A little girl in rural Kenya, no older than 6, stood in her village square holding a drawing she'd made with charcoal and scrap paper. It showed 2 stick figures, one tall and dark, one small and brown, holding hands under a sun with a smiling face. She didn't know about politics or fleets or genetic reconditioning. She just knew someone far away was angry, and maybe kindness could help. Her teacher filmed it on an old tablet and posted it online with a simple caption: "We don't want to fight. We want to be friends." That video spread faster than any war alert ever had. By the next morning, millions had seen it. People began sharing their own moments, cooking meals for neighbors, helping strangers fix broken bikes, hugging parents they hadn't spoken to in years. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, still fear, but something had shifted. Instead of hiding in basements or hoarding supplies, people were stepping outside, looking up and saying, "If this is our last chance to show who we are, let's make it count." Back at the council, the mood was tense. Reports came in that the Cathari had begun scanning Earth, not for weapons, but for population centers, power grids, communication hubs. "The kind of scan you do before you strike." "They're preparing," said a military advisor, voice grim. "They see our gatherings as a threat. They think we're organizing resistance, but we're not," someone shot back. "We're just being human." "That's the problem," the advisor replied quietly. To them, being human might be the threat. Still, Earth didn't stop. In Reykjavik, a choir of fishermen and teachers sang an old Icelandic hymn about light returning after long darkness. In Jakarta, a mosque, a church, and a temple opened their doors at the same time, inviting everyone in for tea and quiet reflection. In Detroit, a retired engineer used spare parts to build a radio transmitter that broadcast lullabies from every culture he could find. Arabic, Mandarin, Swahili, Navajo, on a single open frequency, aimed straight at the fleet. "We're not hiding," he told a reporter. "Let them hear how we soothe our children to sleep. Maybe they'll remember they once had children too." The Cathari envoy, Vrel, finally broke his silence, but not to Earth. Internal comms intercepted by deep space listening posts revealed growing tension among his own crew. Some officers questioned the mission. "They are not attacking," one voice said, shaky with something like doubt. "They are offering." Vrel's response was sharp. "Do not be fooled by emotional displays. Chaos often wears the mask of peace." But doubt had taken root. On Earth, people didn't know any of this. They just kept going. A grandmother in Athens taught her granddaughter how to bake bread the old way, kneading dough by hand, letting it rise slowly, sharing it with the whole block. "If the world ends tomorrow," she said, flour on her cheeks, "let it end with full bellies and warm hearts." In the Arctic Circle, scientists at a remote station turned off their alarms and played recordings of whale songs into space. Deep, haunting calls that had echoed in Earth's oceans for millions of years. "This is our planet's voice," one said into the mic. "Listen to it before you decide we're worth erasing." As the second day drew to a close, the 72-hour clock ticked down. The council prepared emergency bunkers. Hospitals stocked extra supplies. Parents held their kids a little tighter at bedtime. But something strange happened in those final hours before the deadline's halfway point. Fear didn't win. Instead, cities glowed with porch lights left on all night. Strangers smiled at each other on the street. Old feuds were set aside, if only for a moment. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was just people choosing again and again to respond to terror, not with more terror, but with tenderness. And high above, in the cold dark near the moon, the Cathari fleet remained still. But for the first time, their silence didn't feel like control. It felt like they were watching, really watching, and maybe, just maybe, starting to wonder if they'd gotten everything wrong. As the deadline crept closer, the world held its breath. Governments had run out of plans. Militaries stood ready, but everyone knew it was pointless, like bringing a knife to a storm. The Cathari ships hadn't moved, but their silence felt heavier now, like the calm before a thunderclap. Then deep beneath the streets of Geneva, in a lab most people didn't even know existed, a quiet man flipped a switch. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He was a scientist who'd spent years studying how the human mind connects, not just to itself, but to others. He'd been laughed at for believing emotions could be measured, shared, even sent. His project, buried under layers of bureaucracy and skepticism, was called Janus. And it was never meant to be a weapon, it was meant to be a mirror. The idea was simple, almost foolish. What if you could show someone not what you say you are, but what you feel? Not through words, but through the raw, messy truth of human experience. Joy at a baby's first laugh. Grief at a parent's funeral. The quiet pride of growing your own food. The ache of missing someone far away. All of it. Streamed not as data, but as living sensation. For years, the system had been used only for therapy, helping trauma survivors reconnect with empathy, or letting isolated patients feel the presence of loved ones through neural links. But now, with Earth facing extinction, the scientist and a small team of volunteers made a desperate choice. They rerouted Janus through every open communication channel they could find. Satellites, emergency broadcast bands, even old radio telescopes pointed at the moon, and then they opened the floodgates not with a bang. Not with a warning, just a wave. Across the Cathari fleet, something strange happened. Their perfectly ordered systems, designed to process logic, strategy, threat levels, suddenly filled with noise. Not static, not interference, feeling. A Cathari officer monitoring comms flinched as a rush of warmth flooded his mind. The memory of a human child hugging a dog, sun on their face, wind in their hair. Another, checking weapon calibrations, froze as sorrow washed over her. Deep, wordless grief from a grandmother lighting a candle for her lost grandson. It wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. On Earth, people didn't know what was happening underground, but they sensed something shift. So they did what they'd been doing, only louder, clearer, more openly. In a small town in Chile, a group of farmers gathered at dawn, not to pray but to sing, an old harvest song passed down for generations. They held hands, voices rough but true, and let the sound carry into the sky. In Lagos, a street dancer performed in an empty plaza, not for likes or money, but because movement was his way of saying, "I'm still here." In Oslo, a classroom of kids sat in a circle, eyes closed, sharing one word each: hope. Love a home peace tomorrow. Every act, every moment, fed into the Janus stream, not as performance. As truth, the Cathari didn't understand it at first. Their society had long ago purged emotion from decision-making. Feelings were seen as flaws, weaknesses that led to war, waste, chaos. They'd built a civilization on cold reason, and now, without warning, they were drowning in everything they'd thrown away. On the flagship, Vrel demanded the signal be blocked. "It's psychological warfare," he snapped. Shut it out, but his crew couldn't. The signal wasn't coming through normal channels. It was woven into the very fabric of human communication, into the hum of power grids, the pulse of heartbeats in crowded cities, the quiet breaths of people sleeping under the same sky. You couldn't filter it without silencing Earth itself, and Earth refused to be silent. Instead, people gathered in open spaces, not hiding, not arming, just being. In parks, on beaches, on rooftops, they sat together. Some cried. Some laughed. Some simply held hands and looked up at the stars, knowing the fleet was watching. "We're not hiding who we are," someone said into a live stream from New Zealand. "You wanted to see if we're dangerous? Here we are. This is us." Back in the Geneva lab, the scientist watched the data flow. Heart rates syncing across continents, brainwave patterns aligning in waves of shared calm. It wasn't perfect, there was still fear, still anger, but beneath it all ran a current of something the Cathari had no word for: connection. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the smaller Cathari ships, far on the edge of the formation, began broadcasting back. Not a threat, not a command. A single shaky transmission, a recording of a Cathari lullaby sung softly, almost shyly. It was the first time any human had heard their voice used for anything but orders. The scientist didn't hesitate. He routed it through Janus, not to analyze, but to share. Within minutes, parents around the world were playing that alien lullaby to their children, side by side with their own. Vrel was furious. He ordered the rogue ship to stand down, but his command was met with silence, because something had broken, not in the machines, but in the minds of his people. Young Cathari officers raised on doctrine were now experiencing what their ancestors had once known: that logic without compassion is just calculation. That order without heart is just emptiness. On Earth, no one celebrated. There was no victory dance, just a quiet understanding that they'd done the only thing they could. They'd shown their soul. As night fell across the planet, millions stepped outside. Not to watch for explosions, not to hide, but to stand together under the same stars that had watched humanity grow from caves to cities. And high above, the Cathari fleet, once a wall of darkness, began to flicker. Not with weapons charging, with lights. soft, uncertain, but there, like stars waking up. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of questions, full of change, full of something no one had expected. Hesitation from the other side. The Cathari fleet, once a wall of cold certainty, now looked fractured. One ship, the one that had sent the lullaby, drifted slightly away from the main group. Its lights pulsed in a rhythm no one recognized, like a heartbeat finding its way back. Inside the council chambers, no one dared speak first. They watched the feeds, the data streams, the shaky reports from deep space observers. Something was happening out there, something bigger than weapons or treaties. Then came the message. Not from Vrel this time, but from the rogue ship. The words were simple, almost childlike in their honesty. We see you. We were wrong. It wasn't a surrender. It wasn't even an apology. But it was a crack in the armor, and through that crack light got in. Back on Earth, people didn't cheer. They just exhaled, like they'd been holding their breath for days. In homes, on streets, in quiet corners of cities and villages alike, strangers looked at each other and nodded. No words needed. They'd done it, not by fighting, but by refusing to become what the Cathari feared them to be. But the real story wasn't just unfolding in space. It was unfolding inside the Cathari themselves. Deep in their command structure, young officers, raised on rigid doctrine, were now wrestling with something they'd never been taught: doubt. One of them, stationed on a science vessel, had secretly studied Earth's history during the observation phase. She'd seen footage of humans rebuilding after earthquakes, sharing food during famines, risking their lives to save strangers. She'd kept it hidden, ashamed of her curiosity. But now, flooded with the raw emotional stream from Janus, she couldn't unsee it. She sent a private message to her father, a high-ranking officer loyal to Vrel. In it, she included a recording not of war or chaos, but of a human nurse singing to a sick child in a hospital during a long night. The song was soft, off-key, full of love. She wrote just one line beneath it. "This is what they call care. Do we still have a word for it?" Her father didn't reply, but he didn't report her either. Meanwhile, on Earth, a young analyst, the same one who'd first spotted the fleet, was working with a loose network of citizen hackers, scientists, and old radio enthusiasts. They weren't trying to break into Cathari systems. They were doing something quieter, braver, tracing the origin of the hegemony's signals. After days of sifting through faint echoes in deep space, they found it. A dying star system, planets cracked and dry, atmospheres thin. The Cathari homeworld wasn't a fortress of order. It was a graveyard of survival. Their rigid control hadn't come from strength. It had come from fear. Fear of collapse. Fear of feeling too much and losing everything again. The analyst didn't broadcast this as a weapon. Instead, she compiled footage of Earth's own near misses, the climate collapse of the 2040s, the great coral die-off, the nuclear close call of '58. But she didn't stop there. She showed what came after, the global cleanup efforts, the coral nurseries, the peace accord signed in tearful rooms. She sent it all, not as proof of superiority, but as proof of possibility. "We broke our world," the message said in plain, simple words. "We almost didn't come back. But we learned. You can too." The transmission reached the dissident ship first. They shared it quietly among themselves. Then, against orders, they rebroadcast it across the entire fleet. Vrel tried to shut it down. He declared the rogue officers traitors. He ordered them to stand down or be destroyed. But when the time came to fire, his own weapons crew refused. "We've seen them," one officer said over the comms, voice trembling but firm. "They don't hide their pain. They don't run from their mistakes. They carry them and still choose kindness. How is that weakness?" Vrel sat alone on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by silence. The cold logic that had guided him his whole life now felt hollow. He thought of his daughter's message, of the lullaby, of the human nurse singing in the dark, and then, for the first time in decades, he did something forbidden. He remembered. Not data. Not strategy. A memory. His own child, small and fragile, sick with fever. A human medic, part of an old cultural exchange, had stayed by her side for 3 nights humming that same lullaby. He'd dismissed it then as sentimental nonsense. But she'd gotten better, and he'd never thanked the medic. Now that memory rose like a tide. He didn't speak to the council. He didn't issue a new command, but he stopped ordering attacks. He let the silence grow. On Earth, people kept gathering, not out of fear now, but out of hope. In Cairo, a group of elders taught young people how to weave traditional patterns into cloth, symbols of unity, not war. In Vancouver, a community kitchen served meals to anyone who walked in, no questions asked. In the Amazon, indigenous leaders lit ceremonial fires and spoke to the sky, not in anger but in offering. The world wasn't perfect. Arguments still happened. Mistakes were still made, but something had shifted in the air, like the moment after a storm when the clouds part and you realize the sun was there all along. Then, late one night, the dissident Cathari ship sent one final message. Not to governments, not to militaries. To everyone, it was a request. Show us how you heal. And Earth answered not with speeches, but with action. Hospitals opened virtual tours. Therapists offered free sessions in multiple languages. Artists shared songs about grief and renewal. Farmers explained how they brought dead soil back to life. Teachers described how they helped children process fear without passing it on. It wasn't a performance. It was a lesson. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the moon, a once proud conqueror sat quietly, watching, listening, and learning. The deadline had passed. The weapons stayed cold, and for the first time in a long time, both sides were choosing to see each other not as threats but as survivors, just trying to find their way home. The deadline came and went. No explosions lit up the sky. No cities vanished in fire. The Cathari fleet didn't move, not to attack, not to leave. They just stayed there, silent, watching, as if waiting to see what humanity would do next. And Earth for once didn't rush. People stepped outside their homes, not in fear, but in wonder. Children pointed at the sky, not with terror, but curiosity. Are they still there? They asked. And adults, instead of shushing them, said, yes, and they're listening. In the council chambers, the usual shouting had stopped. There was no victory speech, no grand declaration. Just quiet relief and a new kind of responsibility. Because the real work wasn't over. It was just beginning. A few days later, Vrel requested a direct channel. Not to issue demands, not to threaten, just to speak. He appeared on screen, not in his full armor, but in simple robes. His voice was softer now, less certain. We came to cleanse, he said slowly, as if tasting each word. But you did not resist. You did not hide. You showed us your wounds and your kindness. That confuses our logic, he paused. Then almost shyly, we would like to understand. That simple sentence changed everything. Earth didn't send generals or diplomats first. It sent teachers, artists, doctors, farmers, people who knew how to listen, how to heal, how to build, not break. The first exchange happened not in a war room, but in a virtual garden built by students from 10 different countries. They planted digital trees, each one representing a shared value: patience, honesty, care. A young Cathari officer, still hesitant, added a stone at the base of one tree. When asked why, they replied, in our old stories, stones meant I was here. I saw this. I remember. On Earth, people began learning Cathari, not to spy, but to connect. Language apps added basic phrases. Schools held Galactic Understanding Weeks, where kids drew pictures of what peace might look like between stars. One child drew 2 hands, one human, one Cathari, planting a seed together under 2 suns. Meanwhile, the dissident Cathari ship, now called Dawn's Resolve by Earth's media, though the crew never asked for a name, stayed in orbit. Its crew began sharing their own stories, quietly at first, then more openly. They spoke of a society that had forgotten how to cry, how to laugh without purpose, how to hold someone just because they were hurting. Humans didn't offer fixes. They just said, we've been there too. Back on the Cathari homeworld, far away around a fading star, ripples began to spread. The footage from Earth, the emotional streams, the lullabies, the stories of recovery. They leaked beyond military channels. Young Cathari, raised in sterile academies, began asking questions their elders couldn't answer. Why do we fear feeling? What if order without heart is just emptiness? Change didn't come overnight, but it came. A year later, Earth was invited, officially, to join the Galactic Concord as an observer. Not a member. Not a subject. An observer. A first step. The ceremony wasn't held in a grand hall. It happened live. broadcast from a hilltop in New Zealand where elders from many cultures stood together under open sky. They didn't sign papers. They planted a tree, a sapling grown from seeds saved after the great wildfires of the 2030s, a symbol of life that returned after near destruction. Vrel watched from orbit. He didn't speak, but for the first time his eyes held something that Cathari had no word for, something humans simply called tears. Years passed. The Cathari didn't become human, and humans didn't become Cathari, but they learned from each other. Human therapists traveled to Cathari worlds not to fix them, but to help them rediscover emotions they'd buried. Cathari engineers helped Earth rebuild its oldest cities with cleaner, quieter tech, designed not for control, but for harmony. Schools on Earth began teaching a new kind of history, not just of wars and inventions, but of moments when humanity chose compassion over fear. And in those lessons, students always came back to one question. Why did we survive when logic said we shouldn't? The answer was never complicated, because we refused to stop being human, not perfect, not flawless, but human, messy, emotional, stubbornly kind even when it made no sense. The council still meets, but now sometimes a Cathari observer sits quietly in the back, listening. And when debates grow heated, someone will pause and say, "Remember the fleet. Remember what we showed them." And everyone remembers. They remember the nights people stood on rooftops singing into the dark. They remember the drawings sent from villages. They remember the silence that followed the deadline, not of defeat but of awe. Today, if you look up at the right time, you might still see a few Cathari ships in high orbit. Not watching as guards, but as guests, and sometimes on quiet nights, radio amateurs pick up a faint signal. Not a message, not a warning, but a song. A human lullaby sung in a Cathari voice, or a Cathari melody, hummed by a grandmother in Kyoto as she rocks her grandchild to sleep. No one planned this future. No one predicted it. But it happened because when faced with annihilation, humanity didn't reach for weapons, it reached for each other. And in doing so, it reached across the stars. The universe had expected monsters. Instead, it found people, scared, flawed, but willing to show their hearts even when it might get them hurt. And that, more than any weapon or shield, was what saved them. Now when children ask, what happened when the aliens came? The answer isn't about battles or heroes in armor. It's about a planet that chose to be seen, not as a threat but as a home, and in the end, that was enough.